The most dangerous threat to NATO today does not come from Russia. It comes from the United States. Picture this. In Paris, European leaders gathered to defend Ukraine's sovereignty. They talk about borders, they talk about values, they talk about resisting territorial aggression. And yet, at the very same moment, the American president is openly questioning the sovereignty of a NATO ally, Greenland, an island 6 times the size of Germany, an island the US says it needs. This is not a diplomatic misunderstanding. It is not a negotiating tactic. It is a warning signal, because when the strongest power inside an alliance starts threatening the territory of a weaker member, the entire system begins to crack. If you care about NATO, about Europe's place in the world, about how power truly operates today, stay with me. To understand why this moment matters so deeply, we need to step back and look at the forces that brought us here. What exactly is the problem Europe is facing here? On the surface, this looks like a series of disconnected crises. Ukraine fighting for survival, Greenland suddenly thrust into the spotlight, a US administration acting unilaterally, unapologetically. But in reality, these are not separate stories. They are symptoms of the same structural dilemma. Europe's security still depends overwhelmingly on the United States. Its political cohesion, meanwhile, is fragile, and its ability to act independently, strategically, militarily, decisively remains limited. That creates a dangerous imbalance. When Washington supports Europe, the system holds. When Washington hesitates, pressures, or threatens, Europe freezes. That is why, in Paris, leaders were careful, almost cautious to a fault. No one wanted to provoke the United States. No one wanted to risk American backing for Ukraine. And so Greenland became the unspoken test case, not just of sovereignty, but of whether Europe can defend its principles when its protector becomes the source of pressure. To grasp how we reach this point, we need to look backward at the history and mechanics that shaped this dependency. To understand this dependency, we have to return to the moment it was created. After the Second World War, Europe was exhausted, its cities destroyed, its economies shattered, its political confidence broken. The United States stepped in not just as a liberator, but as a guarantor. Through NATO, Washington offered something unprecedented, a permanent American security shield over Europe. And for decades, it worked. The Cold War locked Europe into a clear system. The Soviet Union was the threat. The US was the protector. European nations rebuilt their economies while outsourcing hard security to Washington. When the Cold War ended, that arrangement did not disappear. It simply became invisible. Defense spending fell. Strategic planning atrophied. The assumption hardened. America would always be there. Meanwhile, NATO expanded. The EU deepened economically, but not militarily. Power became unbalanced quietly, structurally. So when today's crises arrive, Ukraine, Greenland, Arctic, security, Europe, reacts within a system it did not redesign, a system built for yesterday's world. And that is why a single statement from Washington can now send shockwaves through every European capital. Then came the moment when theory collided with reality. In Paris, while leaders spoke carefully about unity and restraint, events outside the room told a different story. The United States had just intervened militarily in Venezuela, taking its president into custody. A sovereign country, a unilateral action, no alliance consultation. And almost immediately after, the American president turned his attention north. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. Those words landed like a thunderclap across Europe, because this was no longer abstract, no longer historical, no longer hypothetical. Greenland is not just a distant island. It is an autonomous territory of Denmark, a NATO ally, a European nation. And suddenly, its sovereignty was being discussed as negotiable by the most powerful member of the alliance meant to protect it. Inside that Paris meeting, tension rose. Denmark's prime minister sat across from Trump's envoys under pressure not to push back too hard. Not now. Not while Ukraine still needed American support. This was the first real rupture, a moment when European leaders realized that the rules they rely on may no longer protect them. If this feels unsettling, it should, because this crisis is not about Greenland alone. It is about what happens when power stops pretending to be bound by precedent. And that leads us to the deeper mechanism at work beneath the surface. What we are witnessing here is not impulsive behavior. It is structural. The hidden mechanism is simple and deeply uncomfortable. Power inside NATO is not equal. It never was. The alliance is built on shared values, but it functions on asymmetry. One country provides the intelligence, the command structure, the air power, the ultimate security guarantee. That country is the United States. Europe, meanwhile, has optimized for prosperity, not power. Its militaries are capable, but fragmented. Its decision-making is slow. Its dependence is cumulative. Washington knows this. That is why pressure works. That is why ambiguity works. And that is why threats do not need to be carried out to be effective. When the US president suggests Denmark cannot secure Greenland on its own, the message is not really about the Arctic. It is about leverage. Leverage over Ukraine policy. Leverage over defense spending. Leverage over Europe's willingness to fall in line. This is how power operates in the modern world. Not through declarations of war, but through strategic pressure inside supposedly cooperative systems. And once you see this mechanism clearly, the next escalation becomes easier to predict. Because systems under strain rarely stabilize on their own, they move toward another breaking point. The second escalation is quieter but far more dangerous. There are no troops moving, no missiles launched, no dramatic headlines announcing a crisis. Instead, there is hesitation. Behind closed doors, European officials begin asking questions they are not used to asking. What if Washington goes further? What if pressure turns into action? What if the US simply decides to act first and explain later? Inside NATO meetings, no one wants to say it out loud. But the reality is clear. No European country is prepared to confront the United States over Greenland militarily, politically, or strategically. That silence is the crisis, because alliances do not collapse only through conflict. They erode through doubt. Article 5 exists on paper, but everyone understands its limits. It was never designed for a scenario where one ally threatens another, and so Europe freezes. Leaders issue carefully worded statements. They emphasize dialogue. They avoid direct criticism. Meanwhile, Washington watches, because in power politics, hesitation is data. It reveals where the red lines are, and more importantly, where they're not. This is the moment when a strategic imbalance becomes irreversible, unless something changes. And the consequences of that imbalance are not abstract. They land directly on ordinary people. Now let me bring this down to where it truly matters to you, because strategic imbalance is not an abstract concept. It shapes your future quietly, relentlessly. When Europe hesitates, you feel it in uncertainty, in rising anxiety about security, in the growing sense that decisions affecting your life are being made elsewhere. If you live in Europe, this moment forces a hard truth. Your safety still depends on a power you do not control, a power that may not always share your priorities. And if alliances can no longer guarantee protection, then everything becomes negotiable. Borders, sovereignty, stability. You may never think about Greenland, but you think about prices, jobs, energy, the cost of instability. When Europe appears weak, markets react. When security feels uncertain, investment hesitates. And when leaders avoid confrontation, citizens pay the price in slower growth and deeper fear. This is not about anti-Americanism. It is about agency, about whether your future is shaped by collective decisions or by pressure. And if this makes you uneasy, that reaction is rational, because moments like this define generations. If you want to understand how power affects your daily life, don't look away now, because the shockwaves do not stop at Europe's borders. They travel outward. What is happening around Greenland does not stay in the Arctic. The world is watching. In Moscow, this looks like confirmation that Western unity is conditional. That rules apply selectively. That power, not principle, decides outcomes. In Beijing, the lesson is even clearer. If pressure from inside an alliance works, why rush confrontation from outside? Why test red lines directly when ambiguity weakens them faster? This is how ripple effects form. A signal sent in the Arctic reshapes calculations in Eastern Europe, in the South China Sea, in regions where smaller states rely on security guarantees from larger powers. And then there is Venezuela. When the United States acts unilaterally there and threatens sovereignty here, the message is global. Enforcement depends on interest, not consistency. For the EU, this is the most dangerous consequence of all, because credibility is indivisible. If Europe cannot defend the sovereignty of one of its own members, even rhetorically, even politically, its influence abroad collapses. Alliances are not judged by treaties. They are judged by behavior under pressure. And right now, pressure is exposing fault lines that others are eager to exploit. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. What happens next? There are three possible paths forward, and none of them are comfortable. The first is the optimistic scenario. Europe finally draws a line, not against the United States, but for itself. It speaks with one voice. It reduces critical security dependencies. It treats Greenland not as an embarrassment, but as a wake-up call. In this version, pressure leads to reform. The second path is the muddled middle. Europe continues as it is, managing crises, issuing statements, avoiding confrontation, hoping each shock is the last. The alliance survives but weaker, more transactional, less credible. This is stability without confidence. The third path is the dark one. Pressure escalates. Precedent hardens. Smaller allies learn that sovereignty is conditional. In that world, NATO becomes a shell. The EU fractures under stress, and power politics fully replaces trust. History suggests systems rarely choose the first path voluntarily. They drift toward the second and slide into the third, unless leaders and citizens recognize the moment they are in. Because this is not about Greenland. It is about whether Europe adapts to a world where power no longer pretends to be polite. And that brings us to the final question. What are you willing to do about it? This moment will not announce itself as historic. It rarely does. There will be no formal rupture, no dramatic withdrawal, no single vote that ends an alliance built over generations. Instead, history will look back and ask a quieter question. When the pressure came, did Europe act or did it adjust? Because what Greenland exposes is not a flaw in NATO's paperwork. It is a flaw in Europe's posture. An alliance cannot survive on dependence alone. Values cannot be defended only when they are convenient. And sovereignty, once treated as negotiable, never fully recovers. The United States will pursue its interests. That is what great powers do. The real issue is whether Europe is prepared to pursue its own, not in opposition, but with clarity, with unity, with the willingness to say that some lines matter precisely because crossing them feels uncomfortable. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay with this conversation. Share it, question it, challenge it, because the future of Europe's security will not be decided in one summit or one statement, but by how seriously moments like this are taken. And the next test is already coming.